Now it's live stream, okay? Can you check? Manabendra?
Just give me a moment.
Yeah, go to the YouTube channel. Otherwise, I mean, I can copy paste the link here.
Maybe that would help.
Now it's live stream, okay? Can you check? Manabendra?
Uh, checking. Just give me a moment. It seems like yes, we have. Just give me a moment. Yes, the live stream. While yes. So I think maybe we start. Because people will join on the way. What do you say?
Okay. Well, so once again, thank you everyone for joining this panel discussion being organized by the Abroad chapter of the Breakthrough Science Society. Um, Good morning, good evening, or a good night to all of you, depending on where you're joining from. I'm Shammo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell University working in applied physics, and I will be sort of moderating the first part of this discussion. Um, Before we get started, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Breakthrough Science Society and the Abroad chapter, as well as our panelists for the discussion today. The Breakthrough Science Society is a nonprofit social welfare organization based in India, and Breakthrough aims to cultivate and promote a scientific temperament in society and to explain, disseminate, and popularize different discoveries and advancements of science. Based in India, the Breakthrough Science Society has chapters all over the country that are engaged in diverse activities. Um, Particularly relevant to our discussion today is that over the past several years, Breakthrough Science Society has been working on organizing Indian researchers who are currently engaged in research outside the country, and has sought to engage them on relevant social, political, and scientific issues, both domestic as well as international. And with that goal in mind, we have, and given, of course, the current state of global affairs, we felt that it was particularly urgent to have a discussion on militarism and science and the role that science plays in wars all over the world today. And therefore, we have organized today's panel discussion, and we are pleased to have three members of the coordinating committee of the International Union of Scientists on our panel today. We have with us Professor Michael Gasser, who's a former associate professor of informatics and cognitive science at Indiana University in the United States. And he's an activist for environmental justice, peace, and anti-militarism, as well as solidarity for Palestine. He currently works on language technology for under-resourced languages, particularly in Ethiopia. We're very pleased to have you with us, Michael, and welcome to our panel discussion. Then we also have Dr. Natalya Dinat, who is a medical doctor and a scholar based in South Africa. She's also a steering committee member of Science for the People and a leader of its South Africa chapter. Her work bridges public health, science, and social justice. And she's a strong advocate for peace and the ethical responsibility of science and scientists. Thank you for joining us today, Natalia. We're very happy to have you with us. And finally, the third panelist for our discussion today is Dr. Manabendra Bera. He's an assistant professor at IISER Mohali and a secretariat member of the Breakthrough Science Society. Um, Beyond his research, he's deeply committed to advancing science as a public good, and he's an active voice for social responsibility in science and opposes the destructive use of science and technology and promotes scientifically grounded approaches to addressing the climate crisis and environmental degradation. Once again, thank you to all the panelists for making time for this discussion. Uh, Before we get started, a few ground rules, just to lay out how we plan this discussion. The panelists will speak for around 15 minutes at the beginning. We'll start with Michael, move on to Natalia, and finally Mano. Following that, there will be a moderated discussion and question answer session being moderated by Shiva and Moinak, who are also members of Breakthrough Abroad. In the meantime, we would request participants to please keep your audio muted and your video turned off so that we don't have any logistical issues with this panel discussion. If the moderators ask you call upon you to ask a question, then of course feel free to unmute yourselves and turn on your video. Okay, then without further ado, we should get started, and I would like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Michael Gasser.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And it's especially wonderful to be invited by Breakthrough Society, without which International Union of Scientists wouldn't even exist. So today I'd like to talk about the role of militarization in education using the examples of the United States and Israel. The United States, because it's the most powerful country in the world and the most dangerous country in the world, and Israel, because it's the partner of the United States in war crimes, and it is a really good example of how militarized a society can become. So I'd like to start by going back a long way in history to the rise of nation states, which began in Europe in the 17th century. And with the rise of nation states, there was the need to create a national identity. And compulsory universal primary education, which came a few centuries later in some of these countries, became a way to teach and popularize myths, national myths, mythologized narratives that students were expected to believe in as they became citizens of these new nation states. And in the imperialist nation states, like France and the UK, and later the United States, these national narratives had particular needs, particular characteristics. They needed to treat these nations as exceptional, as special, as in fact even blessed by one or another God. And so we have the slogan, God bless America, which we hear everywhere in the United States. These myths needed to justify conquest or the domination of other peoples as some kind of special civilizing mission. So as we hear commonly, the spread of democracy, in quotes. And for our purposes today, importantly, these myths also needed to romanticize and idealize the military, which is, of course, essential to the imperial projects of these countries. And this included two aspects. First, to create a positive attitude towards the military. So in the United States, we regularly hear, thank you for your service when applied to members of the military, but not to teachers or to doctors, for example. And in addition, there was the need to recruit people, to convince people to be willing to serve, to join the military, and to go to other countries and attack and kill other people. Finally, another aspect of the nationalist narratives for some countries became the exaggeration of the threats to the security of the country, which would justify militarization. So starting with the United States, let's just look at what's spent on this. The War Department, which used to be called the Defense Department, the budget for this entity is close to $1 trillion. That amount may not mean so much to you, but that is in fact more than a third of what the whole world spends on its militaries. And it's roughly equal to all that's spent on public education at all different levels in the United States. But the militarization of society doesn't just include the military formally, it also includes intelligence agencies, which are, of course, involved in undermining other countries. This, in the US, of course, this includes the CIA, and no one knows what the budget of the CIA is. Finally, one aspect of the militarization of society is the role that mass culture plays. In the United States, we have video games and movies that regularly, routinely promote military values, and many of these are actually created in collaboration with the Pentagon. So here you see a picture of people participating in one of these games that was created by the Army. But there's an internal aspect to militarization in the United States as well, not just an external aspect directed at other countries. The United States is a policed carceral society in which $500 billion is spent on policing. This is, roughly half of what's spent on defense in the War Department. So we have policing, we have immigration detention, we have the prison system, and then we have the costs of this system to families. So the United States locks up people at a rate that's higher than any comparable country, any, for example, European country or a country that you might compare to the United States, fifth in the world at the rate of which people are imprisoned. 71,000 people, immigrants, are currently in detention. And this is a racialized system. 1 out of 3 African American men will end up at some point in their life in prison. 1 out of 6 Latino American men will end up in jail. Very different rates than we have for white people. So the United States is a system in which there is a state-private collaboration that promotes violence, promotes discipline, promotes retribution, and US exceptionalism in the world, and portrays a kind of simplistic world of good, that is the US and its allies, and evil, that is everybody else, people. So let me start with the carceral system, which is often referred to, and the role that this plays in education, which is often referred to as the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline takes young people in poor communities and basically through a process with several steps ends up feeding them into the prison system, where they end up as prisoners at a young age in juvenile detention and finally in formal adult prisons. So this results from the prioritization of incarceration over education, with more money being spent on prisons and on the prison system than on education. And this system results from several different factors. First of all, the schools in poor areas basically fail. They're underfunded and they fail to educate. It results from the prioritization of discipline over learning. So students are punished for minor offenses like bringing a cell phone to the class. The schools are policed, as we see in this picture here. We have some places where more money is spent on security than on actual education. And then we have all the different systems of detention that students are put through. This system especially applies to historically disadvantaged populations, to African American students in cities in particular. So for these poor Americans, there really are few opportunities. The opportunities are unemployment, low-paying jobs with no benefits, jail, or what our next topic, the military. So the military sorry, I lost my ability to go to the next slide. Okay. The military in the United States puts a great deal of effort into recruiting people at a very early stage. So there's a program called the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps that sends retired military into the classrooms in 3,500 schools across the country at a cost of $500 million. So this amounts to teaching 500,000 students in these schools. And of course, not surprisingly, they're focusing on the low-income areas where students are more vulnerable, where they're looking for opportunities to escape from communities where they'll likely end up in jail. Not surprisingly, because we know how the military works, there have been many instances of misconduct on the part of this system and sexual abuse of young women who have taken part in the system. So in addition to this, we also have recruiters from the military with access to the schools where they get access to the student data and they can prey on students in the school. Finally, there's military education programs outside the school. We have the STAR-based program where students are given practical experience in the STEM fields. And you can see from this picture, which is from their website, what sort of STEM education the students are getting. This is another way of funneling them into the military early on. So let's look at Israel now, which is an extreme example of what we might call a hyper-militarized society. We all know about the role that Israel plays in its own society and within Palestine and within other countries now that it has attacked: occupation, apartheid, surveillance, genocide, and endless war. Here's a picture of Palestinian men who have been stripped naked and are awaiting the horrendous treatment that such people are put through. Israel spends more on the military than any other country except Ukraine, not surprisingly, 8.8% of its GDP. But Israel also plays a role in the rest of the world, not just in its own region. Israel exports weapons to many other countries, including the United States, including India. It's a world leader in surveillance technology. And Israel uses its weapons on Palestinians as a way, and surveillance technology on Palestinians as a way of testing them before they are then marketed to the rest of the world. So this model of the militarization of society, the role that the IDF plays in Israeli society, has been used as a model for other countries that are trying to figure out how to indoctrinate their populations to love the military and to enjoy, to welcome war. Military education in Israel takes place from a very early age. Children begin learning about their the military needs of their country in preschool. The textbooks have been studied by this researcher. You can see that link later. In these textbooks, Jews and Palestinians are portrayed in very different ways. Jews are portrayed as a people that have always, throughout their entire history, for thousands of years, been surrounded by enemies. All of the outsiders are someone that Jews are taught to be suspicious of. So we see Israelis looking at all of the other nations in their region as potential enemies. Palestinians in these textbooks are never portrayed as actual humans. They're portrayed as a kind of problem that requires a solution. The IDF collaborates with the Ministry of Education in these curriculums. The IDF has out-of-school programs that train students before they join the military. 20,000 of them annually participate in these kind of boot camp programs. So students are prepared not only in school, but they're prepared outside of school for what military life will be like. This teaches them military culture and glorifies the military way of life. Finally, Israel has compulsory military service for all 32 months for men, 24 months for women, and following service in the military, they may be called up for reserve duty. So how could we measure the success of this system from the perspective of the Zionist project? We see that through the indoctrination of education and the media, that we're talking about a country where 93% of Israeli Jews support the ongoing, practically ongoing war of the US and Israel against Iran, which contrasts strikingly, for example, with the unpopularity of this war in the United States. If we look at the attitudes towards the IDF, only 27% of people believe that the conscription system, compulsory military system, should be changed to professional military. 57% are satisfied or very satisfied with the IDF's handling of the war in Gaza, where the rest of the world understands that we're watching heinous war crimes being committed. We're watching genocide underway. More than half of Israelis actually are happy with the way that the war is being conducted. Finally, the results of this system are a kind of racism, where 2/3 of Israeli Jewish teens believe that Arabs are less intelligent, that Arabs are violent, and half of Israeli Jews don't want to live together with Arabs or let their children befriend Arabs. So I don't want to end on a completely negative note. There is opposition in both of the countries I've talked about to these systems. There's a very active counter-recruitment movement in the United States, which is trying to present an alternative message to young people about the military, about war, about imperialism. Here's a picture of one of their campaigns. They're trying to keep military recruiters out of the schools successfully in some communities, which no longer allow the military into the schools. They're doing research on the effects of this, and that's the link to the most active organization there. We also have the prison abolition movement, which is either attempting to reform or to abolish what people in this movement see as an extremely flawed system. In Israel, it's harder to find this kind of activism. There is a small community of young people who refuse to enlist on the grounds of their conscience, who unfortunately, not very many. We see only 12 open refuseniks since the start of the war in Gaza. There are many more people who don't openly refuse, but find other ways to try to avoid serving in the military. And there are two organizations that support these young people. So I want to end on a message that leaves you with the notion that I'm sure you all agree with, that there is a role, that there is a way out, that opposition to these systems is possible and is actually underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for presenting this information about indoctrination of militarism in schools in the US and in Israel. With that, we will move on to our second panelist, Natalya. So I would like to ask you to start your slides and yeah, tell us about militarism, higher education, and academic research.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm going to carry on from where Michael left off, and I'll be looking at militarism in higher education and academic research. So the global situation over the past 50 years has really intensified. And recently, Iran announced that it would bomb US universities in the Gulf unless the universities officially condemn the bombing of universities in Iran by the next day. And this was in response to the US and Israel's illegal and devastating scholasticide, where in Gaza, the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Iran, the US-Israeli axis have been targeting universities and university staff. And this is really a continuation of colonial and imperialist policies in India, Africa, the East and West Asia, and South America. I mean, in Africa, one of the oldest universities in humanity of Timbuktu was virtually destroyed. So today in South Africa, this has been going on the social media, and it just shows the blurring of lines between the military and civil society. So this is a photograph or photographs from Cape Town in South Africa, and the Cape municipality, the municipality of Cape Town, have invited American Marines to train our police. And, there's been a lot of outrage amongst the civil society groups around this. But we have had American Marines training police in methods of crowd control. And for example, the infamous knee on the neck that when they murdered George Floyd. So according to UNESCO, as of early 2026, higher education has been destroyed completely. 95% of campuses are deserted, all 12 universities were non-operational, and at least 193 university teachers were killed. Omar Harb, the university teacher, was starved to death in Gaza. So there are many ways that the military is taking over academia, and I'll just point to some of the larger ways. And this is often referred to as a military university nexus. And it's been creeping up for the past 20 to 25 years. So one of them is how the military really gets involved in funding as governments defund higher education. And that funding can determine the research agenda. It eliminates the commons of knowledge production, and it also limits alternatives for science to get involved in scientific research that benefits the people, and it limits the alternative for communities to dictate the agenda for science research. They also take over the university administration, which often determines policies, and again allows military personnel to enter the premises to quell dissent. And we've had a lot of that in South Africa, where military and military connected personnel and military trained personnel and police trained by military have entered university premises to quell dissent. And as I mentioned before, there's a increasingly blurred line between privately owned for-profit security, the police, and the military. This is a list from an article called The Rise of Africa NLP, Contributions, Contributors, and Community Impact. The article was supposed to sort of show how many good organizations came in, and this is really looking at AI research. And here we have, apart from universities, the US Army Research Office, Defense Advanced Research Projects Activity, as well as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there's this sort of coalescing of the military with the private corporations, including Microsoft and NVIDIA. So what are the consequences of this growing and all-pervasive military-university nexus? So one of them is it eliminates freedom of inquiry for scientists. It prevents critical thinking. It produces and promotes a very conservative and reactionary type of thinking, which I'm sure many of you have experienced or are experiencing already in your universities. And it produces the endorsement that the individual, science is all about the individual and not about society and not about collective work, by promoting sort of individuals in society. And in doing so, it also makes sure that scientists don't join together to fight this, right? It also negatively affects research into science for human good. So we don't get funding for looking at impact on the environment and health, for example. We don't get funding to develop indigenous sciences or true energy renewables. And once again, what that's meaning is that the binary between the military and civilian, which was prevalent during the 1960s and 70s, is becoming meaningless. So as Michael said, students are protesting against this. And here's some students at Rhodes University in South Africa. And they have said all roads lead to colonization of the mind. This was a campaign that Rhodes must fall. And this was in the face of the fact of there was an article published in the Journal of Peace Research, and which showed that the primary factor of militarism was significantly correlated with ideological factors of conservatism, nationalism, religiosity, lack of internationalism, lack of knowledge of foreign affairs, and political cynicism. And with the personality factors also affected, with extroversion, misanthropy, faulty childhood disciplines, lack of social responsibility, neuroticism, lack of empathy. So these things don't come out of the blue, and they are really coming from crises produced within capitalism and the imperialist core, and things that also feed into this complex of promoting militarism are austerity measures, commodification and privatization of education, even health and water are being commoditized and privatized increasingly, and research led by profit motives and seeking mega profits. This also then feeds into further imperialism and more wars as more war machines are being built. And one of the biggest threats at the moment is the development of autonomous drones and killing machines, killer robots. So that is also will lead to destruction of the earth from all along the supply chain. So from the mining of the critical minerals to the use of these military machines, reduced biodiversity, increased death and morbidity of human beings. Scholasticide, so knowledge is being destroyed, banning of indigenous knowledge, and education just for a few people. So the universities have always been a site of struggle. And in South Africa, it's becoming harder and harder to protest within the universities. Here's a photograph from a university in South Africa where private security was brought on to quell a pro-Palestine march. But nevertheless, there are some struggles that are, they still continue. So some of them include the International Union of Scientists. There's an international campaign to stop killer robots and against artificial intelligence. And that campaign is endorsed, it's in, I think, by over 170 organizations, including Amnesty International. There's a campaign to demilitarize education, and students are protesting in countries like Italy, Spain, and even Palestine. Students are protesting. This is the website of Stop Killer Robots. And their coalition works to ensure human control in the use of force, and they want new international laws on autonomy in weapon systems. And these are some of the organizations that are involved in them, including organizations in India, including the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network. This is the website from Demilitarize Education, and they are working for a world where universities champion peace. And they, for any of you in the UK, they have a tool where universities, you can get your university to show how much money is coming from the military industrial complex. And they've just issued a report from Sheffield University showing breaching the moral no-fly zone. Here, for example, Defend Education, University of Bristol, with their tool, students were able to find out the value of partnerships with arm-producing companies, actions that students are doing, top military partnerships. So exposing this is very, very important. And, sometimes people feel a bit despondent that, we're up against the might of America, but just to remind you that Vietnam beat America with very low resources. And the expensive technology is not necessarily superior, but it does make the billionaires richer. So Vietnam, for example, just with making shoes that faced backwards, so to look as if the footsteps are going in the opposite direction, were able to encase many US soldiers into their tiger traps. Iran's drones, which are relatively cheap, have conquered Israel's Iron Dome, etc., etc. However, as Brazilian President Lula says, and Patnik says, that if we lose this and countries like Iran currently fall, recolonization of all of us will occur. So the stakes are very, very high. This is an example of the Lucas Plan, which was in the US, in the United Kingdom, where most workers are about to be laid off. And the workers took over the factory and they built socially useful products after that. And that was an example of workers in action, working with scientists and with the middle management. So another world is possible. This is an example. This is American spending on counter-terror in 20 years, and the cost to end world poverty per year. So, although capitalism is making people feel very despondent, there are many ways that people are able to fight back and resist. And I think this is especially important for scientists and people in tertiary education. As science workers and students, we develop technologies and we should make sure our language is funding and agenda and science education for the public benefit and not for profit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalya, for your slides and for talking to us about how military spending in education is sort of bending academia to its will. I would now like to invite our third panelist, Manabendra Nath Bera, to talk about the academic military industrial complex in the context of India. Okay, take it away.
Thank you, Shambhu. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. First, I would like to thank Professor Michael and Dr. Natalya for laying the foundation, in particular, how from the very young age, these young minds are being indoctrinated to support war and militarism and violence. And at the same time, how in these decades of war, let's say centuries of wars, ultimately arm race is becoming the race for advancement of science and technology, particularly their destructive uses. And I would like to kind of quickly give you an overview that a similar situation that we also witnessing in India. And obviously there are very limited time, so I will not go into details. But here what I would like to discuss. First, how in Indian context, militarization or let's say indoctrination of school students and college students are taking place towards supporting militarism and war. And then I will talk about how science and technology research is now molded to essentially develop something called military industrial complex for profit and kill people. And obviously at the end I will sum up talking about how academia, military and industrial complex actually function in Indian context. So let me be very, directly start here, particularly if you look at the school and college education, particularly the school education in today's time, you will see the school curricula has been gradually been changed, and this change actually has taken place to serve a particular direction. One, actually you can see from here that in the textbooks, you start having text glorifying the wars, particularly Kargil war, Chinese war, and so on and so forth. There are also school programs nowadays starting that lead to visit to war memorials, weapon shows, etc., highlighting heroism of the soldiers, sacrifices of the armies, and so on and so forth. And obviously through that they are developing what Michael was saying, like you have to kind of instill in the students some imaginary enemy and threats that may be a community that is being in India or maybe some neighboring countries. And obviously in this way, they cultivate something called hyper-nationalism. I think that also Professor Michael has kind of mentioned. And obviously, on the other hand, by weakening the science education, they also destroy something called logical questioning or analytical mindset, diversity, dissent, and democratic values. So all together essentially leads to accepting like any solution that can be having through war and military interception. So obviously in this textbook, you will never find some mention of like civilian cost of conflict. You will rarely find ethical debates on war and also the geopolitical complexities. Even the beyond, if you go beyond the textbook, what you will find, there are in the schools in particular, there are observance of many military events. For example, Kargil Vijay Divas, Republic Day military parade, surgical strikes, and so on and so forth. Another one I will come to very soon is called National Cadet Corps, these NCC drills in the schools. And obviously visit to war memorials, weapon shows, and war movies. All these are essentially sometime done to engage the student and essentially align them towards this war mentality. So obviously, if you look at the impact of this, you will see that in this way they essentially can make a broader ideological shift towards militarized nationalism, symbolic association with people and military, and also that creates something called cultural normalization of armed forces. That means the division between civilian and militaries are now being fed. And obviously through that, they develop something called unconditional submission to the army. So just to tell you something, that in India also there are schools being developed to orient students towards militarism, and something called these Sainik schools these were established in 1961 by the Ministry of Defense. And obviously the purpose of these kind of schools to got established is that to have a recruitment pipeline, in a sense, like from these schools the students will go to the National Defense Academy or Indian National Army. Just to give you an idea, these schools contribute to something around 25 to 30% of officer cadets. Initially there were 33 schools, and then it got expanded to more than 100 schools. And there are some debates taking place in India, because these new schools are essentially brought up through something called public-private partnership. So that means even the responsibility and accountability, all these will now be questioned. And obviously this school has have some structural features: military style discipline and hierarchy, military boarding environment, early career orientation towards armed forces. So you understand from the very beginning on, the students are kind of prepared towards the military mindset. And also obviously that helped for the recruitments, military recruitments in the later years. Just to give you the financial scale, in 2019 to 2023, there had been something around 670 crores. And I think this is one of the reference that I found, and there may be something more. Another schools are called Rashtriya military schools. So these I will not discuss in details, you may go back and see. So these kind of schools are essentially there to introduce military mindset in the school level education. Another one is very well known, I think all of you probably know in India. This is called National Cadet Corps. So it's essentially to expose the youth on mass scale in military culture. It got established in 1948 and it operates almost in every school and colleges. And the expenditure coming from the government is actually remarkably high. As you can see from here, it's more than 8,768 crores. What are the activities they normally do? They have military drills, disciplines, and they also send these NCC registered students to go for camping and training with the armed forces directly, even shooting campaign and all these things. And certification also, they provide certification that are linked to recruitment pathway. Just to give you an idea, in from 2019 to 2022, in 4 years, essentially there are more than 2 lakh students got C certificate. They call it, like after you pass through certain test, they got some certificate called NCC C certificate. So from there also you understand how large this network or infrastructure is. And obviously NCC functions less as a direct recruitment pipeline, as you can see for India, unless it is it's different from obviously what is happening in Israel or US, but still this is a very effective instrument of mass socialization of millions of youth, particularly exposing them to military culture. So now I go to this academia military industrial complex, that means on the higher level. If you look at in today's time, I think now it's visible more than ever. If you look at the research and how these are essentially designed and particularly executed, often you will see our research programs are now happening top-down, from using a top-down approach. It's mostly mission-driven. In the most cases, the problem that you would be researching on is defined by the military and their interest. And then once the problem is defined, the research are often taken place in the universities and the institutes, government laboratories, government institutes, and obviously government appointed faculties and scientists. They will carry out that research. Once the research is done and some proof of principle, experiment and viabilities are tested, then the development will take place, something called DRDO's lab. This is Defense Research and Development Organization labs, and they are private collaborator in today's time. And once the prototypes are developed, these are produced in mass scale in the industries, mostly in the private industries. I will come to that. So now talk about this, the largest defense organization we have in India, that is called DRDO. So obviously it operates under the Ministry of Defense, and it has more than 100 laboratories across disciplines. It just to tell you that the scale of their involvement, if you look, they operate over 300 universities and institutions, and thousands of researchers are essentially engaged in this defense and military oriented project. And just to give you an idea, around 1,200 crores allocated for the academic defense research, that means this research part. And this DRDO collaborates with Indian Institute of Science, IITs, NITs, like all the topmost science and technological institutes, the central universities, and obviously the private universities and colleges. Just to give you an idea, you can check, this is there on the internet. There is something called Industry Academia Center of Excellence, and it's essentially the Center of Excellence established by DRDO. And they are there in IISc Bangalore, IIT Delhi, IIT Bombay, IIT Madras, IIT Hyderabad, IIT BHU, IIT Jodhpur, IIT Kanpur, IIT Roorkee, IIT Kharagpur. And if you go to the universities like University of Hyderabad, Gujarat University, Mizoram University, Central University of Jammu, Bharatiya universities, if you just count this Industry Academia Center of Excellence, it goes something around 20 such Center of Excellences, which is directly funded by DRDO. So you can understand that how our research institutes or academic institutes or even the universities are now more or less controlled by DRDO, at particularly their research. I think this is what Dr. Natalya was mentioning. Just by control the funding, just by controlling the fund, you can essentially control what kind of research and what kind of work the researchers will do. So I don't want to further elaborate on, but these DRDO funded centers in the universities and the institutes, they essentially work on some specialized project, and for that they build something called specialized lab, focusing on AI and autonomous systems, drone and weapon systems, electronics and radar, aerospace, cybersecurity, advanced material and missiles. And many of the cases they term them as like dual use research and technology. That means a part of which can be used for civilian uses and other can be for military applications. However, in most of the cases, it is mainly focused towards military applications. And obviously through this military industrial complex create a workforce for defense sector, and obviously to serve that purpose, align the education, particularly higher education, with war and military objectives. So just to give you an idea, for example, if you look at this budget and how it got increased over the years for DRDO, these are the figures as you can see. It's actually gradually increasing. And these expansions, this increase in funding led to expansion of research projects. There are something around 148 new R&D projects approved in last 3 years, and all of them have direct or indirect connection to military applications. And obviously the implication is defense is one of the largest public funder for advanced research in India today. And they obviously to smoothly function and execute, they came up with a lot of policy. For example, there is something called Technology Development Fund, Innovation for Defense Excellence, Transfer of Technology, etc., etc. But all these are framed to facilitate militarization of higher education and research. Just to give you an idea, if you look at it, so there is a statistics over, let's say, 3 years, and there are several years from 2011 to 2021. So you see the India's R&D expenditure, it's actually gradually decreasing. And so these figures are essentially this general government expenditure of R&D as percentage of the GDP. As you can, it's actually decreasing. Also this figure, as you can see, the percentage in change of budget over the years, if you look, obviously for DST, DSI or DVT, all are gradually decreasing. But on the other hand, if you look very carefully, the budget for among all these science funding, the budget for DRDO and Department of Space, which is also part of this military application research, are never got decreased. And as you can see, out of total research funding, R&D funding that we have, more than 50% actually goes for military applications. So this is the situation that we have, I said, India. Just to be very quick, I won't go into details. Actually, the defense, military defense, become one of the most profitable business of today's India. So as you can look how much the budget they allocated for this military or these defense projects. So if you look at from this left panel, you see the defense budget growth more than 2.6 times in last 10 years. And obviously the defense export, so these exports are often done by the private players. I will not go into details, but this defense export increased by 34,000. And as you can see, the share of private sector in defense production has also grown up dramatically. So just to give you an idea that obviously militarism and war has appeared to be the most profitable business of today's economy, and to align and to serve that purpose, both from school to college to university education and science and research has been militarized. So with this, I would like to stop here. If there are some more questions, I will try to address. Thank you.
Thank you to all our panelists for speaking to us about all these different focus areas for how militarism creeps into civilian life, starting from schools to academia and universities, and then finally a more focused view of how things have been evolving in India over the past 10 or 15 years. With that, we've concluded the first part of our panel discussion, where our panelists have sort of presented their opening statements. We shall now move on to the moderated Q&A session, which will be moderated by Shiva and Moinak, who are both members of Breakthrough Science Society's Abroad chapter. So yeah, guys, please take it away.
Right. Thanks a lot, Samuel. So during the registration process, we got some very thoughtful questions from the participant. And I would like to ask these questions to the speakers. So if the person is in the Zoom meeting, then you can directly ask your question. If not, then I can ask the question. So first question we got is from Rabsan Ghalib Ahmed. Are you on the call? So it is related to the research in the new areas of science.
So Rabsan is on the call. Yeah.
Yeah, so if Rabsan wants to ask the question directly.
Yes.
Yeah.
My question to the panelists, especially Manabendra, would be to elaborate if there is something, if we are working on something which may have potential applications in military things. Is there any legal way or any organized way of making sure that we have a we have a restriction of how our intellectual products can be utilized in such scenarios?
Rabsan, you are done with your question, no? Yes? Or yes. So if I understand correctly, obviously we are all researchers, or many of us are researchers, and willingly or unwillingly we are kind of forced to do some research where we don't have much control that what kind of topics we'll be funded with, topic of research we'll be funded with. I think the first thing to understand is that science is not morally neutral. For what purpose you are doing research, and if the purpose is destructive and to kill people, and even after that you participate, that means you are complicit in this destruction or destructive use of science and technology. I think this is the first thing. Second, how you would like to organize yourself, how you would like to get rid of this kind of participating in this kind of research, there can be different mechanisms. I think Natalya can tell you that how scientists and engineers in Google, they resigned en masse, protesting against the AI technology being used in Gaza. And obviously, a researcher can have a say, saying that I don't want to participate any research that have direct implication in killing of people. So the first thing is to understand that there is an issue. Most of the cases we are ignorant. More and more we understand about this problem, more and more we will have common sharings of our thoughts among the scientists, and then jointly we will act. I think Natalya and Michael, if you want to add to this, because this is a very important question, because most of our members abroad are directly or indirectly linked to science and technology or social science research.
If any other speaker wants to add to this.
I'll add something. So, you know, it's a really important question. And unfortunately, there isn't a very clear legal or organized way at the moment. And I think what it's up to us to do is to ensure that at an institutional level, so our university has principles that we will not invest. So we will not invest in, you know, X, Y, and Z technology or become involved in wars. And that in the past has been very, very successful. So in the case of South Africa, for example, you know, it was the universities that really led. We will not invest in South Africa, and you know, and they basically forced a military arms embargo led by students. So that's one level, is working at the level of your institution, and you can use organizations like Demilitarize Education, etc., to do that. Then at the level of international organizing, there are, you know, some of these international organizations in the United Nations affiliated organizations are becoming a little bit moribund or toothless, or, you know, Trump doesn't want to take any notice of them. But I still think it's important that we as scientists can get together and make conventions against certain types of weaponry, for example. So there were a group called Pugwash, were a group of scientists, and they made conventions that were adopted by the UN against chemical warfare, biological warfare. And so it's up to us as scientists to drive these processes. And then there's the action of the individual, which is very brave and very laudable. And they, you know, there was a professor in Norway who's found out that his research in drone work was being taken by these military groups and being made into killing machines, and he resigned his post. Now, those actions, if they're done on an individual basis, may not have the impact that we need, right? So I think the idea is that scientists really join together, work across the board in your institution, work across the board internationally, and we make those legal or quasi-legal, you know, conventions, binding conventions, etc.
You know, I'd like to add two other levels where these things can happen to what Natalya brought up. First of all, there are professional organizations. So every field has associations, national and international. Mathematicians have their own organizations. And within each of these organizations that I'm familiar with, there's been a movement over the last few years to have them make a strong statement, for example, that they oppose the use of their work in the genocide in Gaza, for example, or in military applications more generally. This has been really challenging, of course, because so much money funds so many of the people, especially the more powerful people in these associations, that these movements have often failed. Take mathematicians, for example. Mathematicians in the United States are in demand in the cybersecurity world. They're hired by the National Security Agency, which is a powerful spy organization within the US government. That's where they're wanted, right? And there's been a movement there to try and counter-recruit, to go to meetings that this association has, where the NSA has a table and is trying to recruit students to prevent that from happening, to argue there are other ways to do your work. I mean, be a math teacher, for God's sakes. Teach in a high school rather than selling your labor to spy on people around the world. And another level where the organizing happens is around the graduate student level. In the United States, graduate students are unionized in some states and some universities, and the unions have supported graduate students within scientific fields, in some cases, to refuse to do research within their labs that's related to the military, that's funded by the military. It's happened on a very small scale, only in a small number of places, but it's a place where people have banded together, students, to try and prevent what they're doing, the research they're doing, from being used for military purposes.
So I would like to add one more thing, because eruption about your question. What Michael obviously mentioned, there are national and international level groups. Just to give you, there has been a recent manifesto of quantum disarmament. Like all quantum technology scientists and experts, they came together and they demanded certain things. First thing they demand is that at least disclose where from you are getting the fund. Let's say whenever we are asked to do some research, sometimes it is not disclosed. Sometimes it is routed in such a way, it's hazy. You cannot find who is essentially the main funder. So they are saying that at least disclose who is supplying the fund, or who is funding that particular research. The first thing you have to remember, all these things are happening, and they could do because the common people, even the people who are in the academia, because they don't know about it. The moment the people will get to know that, and there is always a pressure of the people which forces the government to step back or roll back what they started. For example, think about what is happening in the context of Iran war. Trump is kind of being forced to step back because of the upcoming election happening in, for example, just to give you an idea, coming up in USA. One of the reasons, obviously. So what I wanted to say from here, they always try to take the advantage of people's ignorance. So as a scientist, as an academician, it is our task also make such a situation where the funding agencies are forced, the universities are forced to disclose where from they are getting the fund. And the moment you will have such figures in front of anyone, people will immediately understand for what purpose the military industries, for example, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Corporation, what would be their purpose essentially to fund a research? People will immediately understand it. And this is exactly, has been very clearly demanded in this quantum disarmament or quantum for disarmament manifesto. So for option, just to give you an idea that how we can function and do some action. Yes.
Yeah, I think all the speakers. So the next question is from Samyak. If Samyak is on the call, then you can ask your question directly. And the question is related to the defense research. So is defense research different from militarization of research? So I don't think Samyak is on the call, but the question is defense research different from militarization of research? And if Dr. Dinat wants to say something about this.
They cloak it and name it in many, many ways, right? And it's interesting when Michael opened up that in the US, they're becoming more and more brazen, and their Department of Defense is now called the Department of War. And Pete Hegseth is now the, Secretary for War. It doesn't matter how they clothe the thing, and I think there's a comment or a question in the chat as well, and it really talks to this idea of, do we need a defense industry in our country, like in India, for example? And I think we need to be very clear about, whose side we're on and what the nature of our country is. So in America has been at war. I think, Michael, you can for the most part, I think all but 10 years of its existence. It is an aggressive imperialist country. And for the most part, wars are fought by aggressive imperialist colonial interests, right? Or settler colonial interests. Israel, for example, has this idea of Greater Israel. They need to suppress the people living within, the land that they've stolen. And we don't really need all these weaponries. We've got enough bombs and nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many, many times over. And the idea that, there's always a threat, I think is really, China hasn't invaded. There have been border skirmishes, it's true, but they've not invaded anybody. The imperialist countries invade other countries. And so, for example, I see that countries like Iran, who are targeted by the US for invasion, countries like Venezuela, countries like Cuba, yes, perhaps they do need a defense capability, but the idea that, all these countries must be armed to the teeth as a deterrent, it's been shown in history not to have worked. It doesn't work.
Thanks a lot,
I
Dr.
think I'm gonna go with one of the questions from the chat. So Dibya Shankar Das has asked,
Guys,
there is a common narrative that a more powerful country is less likely to be invaded by other countries. And that's why we need to have a strong military. And to have that, we need a high budget or R&D in the military. What are the comments on this? So, Professor Gazer, if you want to take that.
Well, I think this is a very hard question. I mean, it's really what Natalya was talking about. I think it's, yes, when we're talking about the United States or Israel, it makes perfect sense for us to be fighting the militarization of these societies because we're talking about imperialist countries and settler colonial countries. Fighting the military means fighting really on behalf of the victims of these imperialist projects, the Palestinian people and the Iranian people currently. But to argue about fighting militarization in countries of the global south is a bit more complicated. And I'm curious to know what Manab says, but I think I would go with the idea of defense, spending on defense where we really mean defense rather than offense. Because as we know, as Natalya said, now they're honest about what the Department of Defense really has been in the United States. It's been the Department of War all along, the Department of Offense, right, not defense. But I'm curious to know what Manab thinks about this. It's a very
so thank you. I think it's a very, very good question. I think we need to really dissect the problem in a little bit further, First, think about it. One is militarization of research for business and profit. This is one important thing. Another, militarization of science, or let's say finding some military application of science and technology to defend our sovereignty. These two are not exactly same thing. For example, think about what USA is doing. Iran is no way a threat against the sovereignty of USA. Why these war they are still conducting or continuing? Just to siphon off billions of dollars as profit. And these profits are not, this is a very important point, not going to the American people. These profit is going towards Lockheed Martin, Northrop Corporation, Boeing, General Dynamics like organization. And so that means it's essentially the top capitalist layer of America. So this is very important. When we talk about defense, defending whom? Some comments you may say that, oh, I have Pakistan here, I have India here. Look at the people of Pakistan and people of India, their economic status, the miseries, the education system, the health system, all that we face through every day. you will not find almost any difference. So whenever there is a war, it's very clear it has very, very little to do with the common people. The same also applies for Iran and USA. However, in this particular case, America is doing something called war of aggression. And Iran, although they may have many different, you may come up with many different arguments like Iranian regime was not so democratic in protecting the human right within Iran. However, the argument you may have, but still they are trying to protect their sovereignty. It is the Iranian people to decide whether there will be a regime change or not. Who will be next in power in political arena. So just to give you kind of a clarity here is that every war is not a just war. In today's time, most of the wars are instigated, stimulated, fabricated to make profit. That you can see what happened in last 20 years in the Middle East. Now coming to another point, always remember all these development of military technologies which are used in different countries in different context of war are now being used on the civilian on their own country. Look at what happened in USA. Their own military technologies have been used to surveil their own citizen. NSA, you talk about Edward Snowden, you probably know about that. Their own military technologies are now being used to suppress the protest for the liberation of Palestinians. In India also you will find. So that means as far as the moment military technology is concerned, when if you discuss about it, it is only for profit. And that is why you will see over the decades, more and more private players are handed over to develop military technology, to develop military market, or to take control over military market. So I think the moment you look at from this perspective, then you will immediately see any country they want to defend their country through military technologies, they are not going to privatize that. The moment they start privatizing it, it essentially no more about defense, it's more about war of aggression, so that more and more artillery, more and more army materials can be sold or bought, and so that more and more business and market can be there. So just to answer this part, I don't want to extend it. Thank you.
We have one question from Prem and also from Natalya. So I'll take the question from Prem first. Prem, if you want to unmute yourself and if you could just tell your question.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. My question was for the panelists, and like if anyone else want to answer it as well. It's my claim, and I think it's my observation. I've seen people nowadays have become very desensitized towards wars and whatever the crimes are going on. Maybe it's my just personal experience or anecdote. Okay, I've seen people whenever such wars in maybe Gaza, Palestine, or even the recent Iran one, and were going on, and people usually didn't tend to care about it. But when those things actually started affecting them in maybe gas prices and all, then they started caring, and that also like it became some political ideology or political fight between them, who is right and who is, instead of caring about or the inhuman things going on the grounds for the victims of those war affected people. Instead of caring them, they like it's just about like, oh, what is the right thing, or what is the right politics, or what is that kind of thing. And also like my another question was relevant to this as well. What kind of an individual and educational institute themselves has to make a reform or change, especially in science, they should more focus on science is meant for nurturing of mankind and like all the living beings on the planet, and not for the destruction. So what kind of steps has to be taken by individual and education institute as well to focus on that part, war is not the only solution. And like technology and all the developments are not meant to kill. They are meant to, save, and all the problems, like they could be sorted with a better alternative rather than just, going on war and invasions and all that. So that was my question.
Anyone of the panelists would like to answer?
Yeah, so I'll combine the comment that I wanted to make before. So for Prem, I mean it's not accidental, and that Michael talked about how video games are being invested in, like Hollywood movies, and that goes a long way in desensitizing people to war. And even soldiers, because to kill another human being, you have to dehumanize that other human being. And you can even remove yourself by saying, okay, now we just press buttons, right? Barack Obama was very good at pressing buttons for drones that were murdering, wedding goers indiscriminately, etc. So there is that idea that the media is always desensitizing us to the horrors of war. And I think, yes, I agree with Prem, and we need steps to do a charter for banning of certain research avenues. It's really a really strict regulation on certain research avenues. That's important. So I also wanted to make the comment about war in general. So apartheid South Africa had developed nuclear capability. Apartheid South Africa had developed a formidable war machinery that invaded the neighboring states. And when we had our freedom and democracy under Mandela's government, one of the first things that we did was denuclearize. So we did a unilateral denuclearization. And that really hasn't put us under any extra burden or threat of being invaded, right? It's just lowered the temperature a bit. So I don't agree and with the idea that the more military you have, the more deterrent it is. And I think coming back to Manab's comment, armies also are used to quell internal dissent. And a lot of the role of armies is that if the people, start demonstrating, the army's brought in, and that's a very big role for the army. And they're using a lot of technology to do so, both surveillance and, in terms of water cannons and bots to do so. If a country is invaded, it's not the army that's going to defend, it's the people that are going to defend that country. And people's militias are going to defend that country. So, for armies are generally an offensive thing in the context that Manab was talking about. And military expenditure is a really big profit-making aspect. And I think we have to bear that in mind. So thank you. That's my comments.
I would just add that this desensitization that we're seeing to the horrors around us is something that we, as activist scientists, as activist people, need to be actively combating. That's what we need to be working on. We need to be working on politicizing people. And politicizing means making sure they see that these systems, that these are part of systems. There's nothing wrong with the technology that's being developed inherently. There's nothing wrong with drones. Drones take some of the most beautiful photographs that have ever been taken in the history of photography. But drones can be armed and become killing machines. It's the system that funds the development of drones for particular purposes that there's nothing wrong with the internet. The internet was developed by the military, right? But it's the system that we need to challenge. It's not the technology per se, and it's not enough to say, what should the university do? The universities are funded by powerful forces that are in bed with the corporations that Manab has been talking about, that are making these profits. We can't simply go and ask universities to be better at organizing the research to support society. We have to challenge the whole system. This is a really long, hard project that we have ahead of us, but it's not enough to think what individuals could do or even what universities should do. We have to be about seeing the system-wide issues and challenging the whole system.
If there is some time, I can just add one more point. So in our founding convention, or the first convention that we had on behalf of International Union of Scientists, our guest was Professor Richard Falk, who was a special rapporteur of Palestinian cause from the UN. And he mentioned that history shows no conflict got resolved by war. Give me one example that this conflict got resolved by war. No. So the wars are essentially fabricated, manufactured to take advantage of certain things. And this you will clearly understand if you ask this question, who is economically benefiting from that? Just simply ask and find that answer. Things will be immediately clear. So this is exactly the point. We, the scientists, we develop technology, new knowledge. And the question is that, do we want it to be used for war or for the benefit of science? So that means at the end of the day, scientists have to stand against the war economy and in the main imperialism. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and there are some comments on the chat that countries are using military on their own people. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think Natalya already said, nothing is happening out of the blue and suddenly. All are part of the policy. How you will treat your people, also part of that policy. And these people are always either appointed or share of the benefit, take the share of this benefit of this war industry. If you look at, starting from George W. Bush to all the defense minister in America, you will see all are high-level appointed official of Lockheed Martin or Boeing or this. You check it. All. You will not find even a single exception. Starting from Dick Cheney to you take a name. So this is the part. And second, yes, there is absolutely no reason to say the government institutions are inefficient while the private institutions are efficient. No. Unless the government purposefully erode and weaken that particular institution, the institution cannot be destroyed. For example, take an example of BSNL in Indian context, how it has been eroded and destroyed to give market for Airtel, Haz or Vodafone. In the same manner, the DRDO, even if you say in this way, I think I'm talking about the comment, just looking at the comment, I'm just answering to Mr. Avik. DRDO is efficient. The Hindustan Aeronautic Limited, HAL, has decades of experience. But you see the projects are going to someone else. There is a reason for that. So if you say government institutions are inefficient, then that means I have to ask the parliament should be privatized. Why the parliament should be public then? Right? So this doesn't work. Unless the government function to give benefit to a certain section, and in today's time to harness unimaginable amount of profit, war is the only solution. This is called militarization of economy. And it is the general phenomena, be it in the advanced imperialist country or the global south. You look at all the countries, they have the same trend, because otherwise in today's economy cannot just simply sustain. Okay.
Any last comment from Dr. Gasser, and then after this I will ask Abhishek for the conclusion. So Dr. Gasser, do you have any last comment that what is your thought on countries using military on their own people?
Well, I wanted to refer back to Natalya's example. What happened in South Africa was amazing and revolutionary, but that's That's something that required a decades-long liberation struggle and a worldwide movement in support of what changed. So it makes us realize what it takes to turn things around in the directions that she talked about, both in the direction of how the military is used against its own people, and in the direction of demilitarization, of the decision not to develop nuclear weapons. Look at what a long struggle that was. And so it makes us realize this is not something simple. It means changing things fundamentally.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Gasser. So I
Can
would,
can I just add really quickly?
yeah, sure.
It's on, that the argument that we need military research so that everybody, all manners and all branches of science can benefit, which is absolutely not true. And I mean, so I agree with Manab. In China, for example, they are using drone research to help in agriculture, to lift, oranges out of mountainous areas and put them on the train. They're using drones for firefighting. So we can use drone technology for the really dangerous jobs in working in deep mines, for example, or undersea, or even shoveling excrement, the demeaning jobs that humans aren't supposed to be happening. But because drones are owned by for-profit companies, they're being used to take over the things that human beings should be doing, like, for example, writing music, or working in the arts, in filmmaking. So I think that we really should be fighting for the use of drones in that way. And then a really quick one on the Ukraine, although it's not a quick question. So I studied in the Soviet Union, and the Ukraine didn't have military capacity. The Soviet Union had nuclear capacity. The Soviet Union had nuclear capacity. And they have been a fascist movement in the Ukraine that has been, from the time of before the Maidan coup, that has been encouraged and supported by NATO to threaten Russia. And NATO's expansionism, which they kept on saying from the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO, Soviet Union, Russia was saying, we do not want NATO to expand. And NATO said, we won't, and then it did, and it did, and it did. So I think it's not a correct interpretation to say because Ukraine only got invaded because they were demilitarized and gave up its nukes. I don't think that's it's a very complex issue. But I think that we all need it, as Michael said, it's a long job that we have ahead of us, and we need to work together in a coordinated fashion.
Right. Thanks a lot for your comments, Dr. Dinat. So I would like to ask Abhishek to take over, and we can do the conclusion of the program.
Thanks, Shiva. So I would like to conclude by sincerely thanking all our panelists, all the members of the audience, and the organizing committee for making today's program meaningful and successful. So we're deeply thankful to our speakers for sharing such important perspectives. Professor Michael Gasser spoke about the militarization of the school education. Dr. Natalya Dinat discussed the militarization of research and development, and Dr. Manabendra Bera at the end brought both these issues into the Indian context, helping us connect this broader discussion with our own reality. What we learned today is that science and education are not isolated from the society. They are connected to the larger social, political, and economic forces around us. That is why it is not enough only to do science in the lab or on the computer. We must also understand how science affects the society and how society shapes science, especially in the times marked by wars, inequality, and conflict. In this context, the role of Breakthrough Science Society becomes very important. It is working to create awareness and empowerment not only among ordinary people but also among students, teachers, and researchers and scientists so that science can be linked to social responsibility and human progress. So I would like to request you all, if this discussion has inspired you by any way, please join and support Breakthrough Science Society. And you can always take the membership by scanning the QR code I will just put in the chat box. And I can also share it on the screen. I don't know if it is visible or not.
It's still not visible.
But on the chat we can see.
Yeah, on the chat then, I think. So I would like to encourage people to visit the Breakthrough Science Society website, and if you feel that these efforts are relevant, support us by taking the membership. Thank you all again.
Thanks to all the speakers and all that joined.
Thank you very much. And thank you obviously to Natalya and Michael. So I think we can have a very quick, at least about our